Welcome to the first module in Advanced Valuation. Here we're really going to be introducing the major issues, the major themes, if you like, the way of looking at property that distinguishes this unit from the other valuation subjects. Here we're going to be covering over the period of our 12 weeks of the unit a number of aspects of property that relate to the more complex and deeper issues related to property. In particular, we're going to be looking at income producing and complex properties. Usually complex properties are income producing properties, things like hotels, that's liquor serving hotels, motels, factories, complex buildings. So you might have a single building which has a number of different types of land use, residential, commercial, and perhaps retail, and how we look at that from a real estate point of view. Overall, we're going to be looking far more at the income aspect of valuation. But even though we're going to spend most of our time looking at complex cash flow models of real estate, have to remember that even then, the comparables approach is still the simpler and the stronger, very often, approach to valuation, even for these interesting and tantalizing properties. We're going to be exploring some more the complexities of the arguments behind DCF, as well as the application of DCF in a more complex way. We're going to be introducing a completely different approach to doing DCF. The period by period approach that we dealt with in the previous subject, property investment and finance, is going to be replaced now by more of an annuities approach. This is really doing the same mathematics but a bit more compact, so that's going to be basically extra Excel skills. On the other hand, we're going to be looking at the question of plant and machinery, specialised valuation. We're going to look at indigenous title in a bit more detail. So we're going to be covering a number of different aspects here. We have as our textbook, it's an advantage if you obtain the textbook. I know a lot of students find the expense uncomfortable, and so it's not absolutely prescribed. We're not going to have specific questions in the exam, have you read chapter 6 or something like that? But there are a few chapters which are really, really important. Of those, most important one is the chapter on specialised valuation. If you can get access to the textbook, say from a colleague at work or the university library, that might get around it. With textbooks, if you're practicing as a valuer, textbooks can be looked at as a resource for your professional career, not simply something that you look at university, then you put away or use as a doorstop for the rest of your life. Especially in the valuation area, it may be a different issue with things like statistics or accounting or what have you, where you're not likely to become an accountant or a mathematician or a statistician or what have you. But the valuation textbooks are usually good resources that in some cases you only get to really appreciate after you graduate. And that's one of the reasons that we set out the textbooks that we do. Not only for your 12 weeks of learning in this particular unit or that particular unit, but rather so you have a resource for your lifelong learning. And this is something that you really need to be thinking about, because there might be issues that you come across in 3, 5, 10 years' time that get you going back to your university notes and reading your textbook in a more detailed way. So I do recommend that you consider quite seriously the textbook. Now, for this unit, one of the introductory activities is a look at a applied capitalization valuation. It comes from the textbook, but the page for the textbook I have available on the Moodle site. So that's just there as a little extra in case you don't have the textbook or you don't want to get it. I recommend that you go through all of the exercises as you go through the unit in general, and this unit is no exception. Here we're going to start off by looking at capitalisation, but we're going to be moving in the unit as a whole into the bigger question of DCF. Overall, the theme in this unit is looking at property more as a set of cash flows. Now, we've introduced that in property investment and financing, but we're really going to be taking it further in this unit. The perspective in property investment tended to be from the investment point of view, so we're looking at the investor's perspective. Here we're looking at the property perspective. We're going to be considering some of the issues there as to how these two perspectives interact, and we might talk about that a little bit as we go along. It's a good idea, by the way, to make sure that you do read the study guide carefully, because we'll go into a lot more detail I'm going to cover here. When a valuer values a property, he is really trying to predict what individuals that he does not know are going to behave when they come to take interest in a property, whether that's a private treaty sale, look in the window, see the property, fall in love with it and make some offer, or whether it's in the heat and excitement of an auction room. The valuer's job is really that of a psychologist. He has to predict how the successful purchaser is going to think, and perhaps the psychology of those around them. Okay. That means that a good valuer will really have a good understanding of the thinking of the likely purchaser. What kind of a person is it? Will it be an owner-occupier? Will it be an investor? Will it be somebody who wants to use this property for income-producing property or income-producing purposes, or simply as a way to park some money to avoid tax, or or one of the many reasons that people buy property. When we apply income approaches to property valuation, often we try and make the process too scientific, basically. And we find this with a number of the other more complex approaches to valuation, say multiple regression analysis for automated valuation systems and so on. We're really making assumptions about the way that the world works that regularizes them a little bit, probably too far very often. And this is just as evident in most markets. But when we look at income-producing properties, the capitalisation approach, it's a good idea to actually think in terms of what's going on here. In the capitalisation approach, we make assumptions about the thinking of the prospective buyer. We say the prospective buyer is going to be expecting a capitalisation rate, a yield rate, which is comparable to other properties in the area, and so we're going to assume that the purchaser has some kind of market knowledge, got an idea of rents and values in similar properties and so on, and maybe they're going to apply some little bit of a nudge in terms of risk or a margin for the age of the property or what have you. And so looking at those things is important. When we move into the DCF world, that psychologist forecasting telepathic demand on the valuer actually gets more intense, while DCF is intended to cover all bases, consider all variables and so on, and that's exactly what it does. In doing that, it makes a huge number of assumptions about the purchaser. When we looked at the purchaser from the point of view of an investor in property investment and finance, we were very comfortable to put into the psychology of the investor the fact that they're most likely going to use debt leverage to purchase their property. And so that means that the whole risk and return characteristic of the investment is going to change, because leverage does that, basically. When we move into using complex income-producing approaches for valuation, we tend to leave debt out. That's a current norm. I don't think it's a bad norm, although I think that there is a certain debate about whether or not it should be invoked or not. Certainly as a valuer, if you want to understand the market, it's very important that you understand what the typical levels of leverage are. They have changed over time. They may change into the future. Certainly when there's changes in market sentiment, if you like, the market psychology between optimistic and pessimistic, often the banks will pull in the rails. They will accept only a more moderate level of leverage, and so that can have an effect on the prospective purchaser's situation, their aggressiveness in going into the auction room and so on. So this question of whether loan finance should be included in the mix, in the model, is a fairly live one. Generally for commercial complex properties, debt is ignored, and while that might be debatable, that's simply the perspective that we're going to be using here. And we can see that the attempt to make this objective, which means to get it away from the personal inclinations, perhaps the irrationality of individuals and so on, their subjectivity. An objective valuation is meant to be, that thing which somehow is scientific, is going to be actually there, you can touch it or observe it in some way in the market, and that's the assumption that we make in advanced valuation. Things like other things are also important to consider when we're making this adjustment. For instance, is taxation relevant for the valuation of commercial property? In a totally objective framework, most taxes, certainly income tax and so on, drops out of the picture. And the reason for this is that different purchasers will have different tax situations, and they may be even in a situation where they pay very little tax at all. That's a completely different study for a different day. But the important thing here is that by making this assumption, we leave tax out, we do appear to be valuing the property, not the investment, which is very important when you're a property valuer. And we appear to be taking out a dimension of the situation which is human and foible and not related to the property. At some point, it's a good idea to give some thought as to whether that's a fair decision to make, a fair position to take. And the reason for that is that, yes, we are valuing the property. We are not valuing the investment attractiveness. And so, yes, we should have something which works, gives us a single value, whether it's the Queen of England or somebody scraping together some venture fund capital or what have you, and both of them are in their auction room together. Shouldn't really matter who the purchaser is. And so by taking their tax situation out of the situation, you do that. However, the counter-argument is that in an auction room, typically most of the people there, especially if you've got a bit of an idea of what kind of a person is going to be buying the property, they will all have a tax situation, and in general the tax situation will be relatively similar and to a certain extent something which is capable of estimation. And if you've got an important issue, whether it's tax or perhaps leverage or something else, which bears on the psychology of the purchaser, then it's a fair question to ask, why doesn't the valuer take that into account? Now, the valuer is going to duck and dodge and say, well, actually, I'm not a psychologist. I don't get to take all of the people in the auction room and lay them on a couch and ask them about their childhood and all the other sort of complicated things that make them make decisions. I simply watch the data. Is that the right way? Is it the wrong way? It's for you guys to give some thought to, because you have to remember that even those might seem a very obscure and deep question, it will be one which will come along to haunt you pretty much for the rest of your professional lives. The last point that I'd like to make about this first module is the importance of modelling. Now, I mentioned before we're going to be introducing some new skills and some new approaches, if you like, to the question of modelling. We're going to be spending a fair bit of time later on looking at things like rental valuations, which tend to be very interesting. We're also going to look at ground rent question and so on. Again, very interesting. They all have to do basically with looking at property as a set of cash flows. We're going to be using the DCF approach, which we've now done in previous units a fair bit. So be prepared for a fair bit of modelling. And as I mentioned earlier on, we're also going to be getting into some deep theory in various other areas and questions about property. So I hope you enjoy the unit. Make sure you read the study guide, follow through by doing the activities that are listed there, and the reading if you have the textbook.